listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasser-jayne.com. Before we begin today's show, I want to share with you some exciting news. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show, already syndicated on so many stations, is now syndicated on all Amazon Alexa devices. Program your device, say the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, then have a listen. How easy is that? Enjoy. Now, this week on Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne, we're playing with new title. Let us know what you think. We return to the subject of World War II, beginning with the story of the little-known saga of young German Jews, dubbed the Ritchie Boys, who fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, came of age in America, and returned to Europe at enormous personal risk as members of the United States Army to play a key role in the Allied victory. It's an extraordinary story, well told in the book Sons and Soldiers. My guest, New York Times bestselling author Bruce Henderson. And at the bottom of the hour, another powerful story of World War II, as told by New York Times bestselling author David King. His book is The Trial of Adolf Hitler, the Beer Hall Putsch, and the Rise of Nazi Germany. So, let's get started. Joining the ranks of Unbroken, Band of Brothers, and Boys in the Boat, author Bruce Henderson's riveting new book, Sons and Soldiers, tells the little-known saga of the young German Jews who fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s, came of age in America, and returned to Europe at enormous personal risk as members of the U.S. Army to play a key role in the Allied victory. In 1942, the U.S. Army unleashed one of its greatest secret weapons in the battle to defeat Adolf Hitler, training nearly 2,000 German-born Jews in special interrogation techniques and making use of their mastery of the German language, history, and customs. Known as the Ritchie Boys, they were sent in small elite teams to join every major combat unit in Europe, where they interrogated German POWs and gathered crucial intelligence that saved American lives and helped win the war. Though they knew what the Nazis would do to them if they were captured, they eagerly joined the fight to defeat Hitler. Sons and Soldiers is an epic story of heroism, courage, and patriotism. Let's talk.
So, Bruce, I have to tell you, this is really, truly some story. And until now, oddly, so little known. What brought you to the story of the Ritchie Boys?
Well, what brought me to this story of the Ritchie Boys is, and it's not anything I had ever heard of, and I'm a military historian. I've written several books on the war, but it just accidentally, I guess, I was reading an obituary 3 years ago of a man in his 90s, and it said that he had his family in Germany had gotten him out of there as a boy in the 1930s through a Jewish relief organization, and he'd come to the United States. His family did not make it out, died in the Holocaust, and was came of age in America. And then when war broke out, he went into the U.S. Army and was part of this specially trained unit to interrogate German prisoners of war, and they were called the Ritchie Boys. And I thought, my gosh, I've never heard of them. I wonder who they are. And that sent me off to Google the Ritchie Boys, and that began really a 3-year journey for me in which I set out to find as many of these guys, of course, now all in their 90s, still alive, as I could, to talk to them about their stories.
Here's why I knew. I lived right near Fort Ritchie. so I had a farm near there, so that's why I knew. But talk to me about this. That's Fort Ritchie. Explain to people why they were called the Ritchie Boys before we go ahead.
Yeah, well, these fellows who were born in Germany and were brought into the U.S. Army when the war broke out. However, the Army didn't know quite what to do with them. They had German accents. They were still German citizens, which made them enemy aliens, and there was some question as to whether they could be trusted, all of those kinds of, I guess, prejudices. And somebody got smart early on, though, in about mid-42, and decided that these guys could be an asset. They knew the language of the enemy, the culture, the psychology, the geography, the history of it all better than really anybody could teach Native Americans. So they opened up a top-secret military intelligence training center Camp Ritchie, Maryland, and these guys started getting these orders to come in for 2-3 months of training in interrogation techniques and other military intelligence aspects. And then when they graduated, they were assigned in small teams, 4- and 6-man teams, to every combat unit, then preparing for the invasion of Normandy. And they jumped with the paratroopers on D-Day, and they were with Patton's tanks racing across Europe, and they were in every battle, every campaign.
Okay, so tell me this, though. First of all, how many were involved in this? How many?
Well, yeah, there were about 10,000 men went through Camp Ritchie during the war as not only learning to become interrogators, but interpreters, psychological warfare experts, photo intelligence. There was a wide range, of course, but the interrogators themselves, they were called the IPW teams, interrogate prisoners of war. There were about 400 of them out of the 10,000, and of those, we know at least 60% were Jewish, probably more. In those days, the religion often didn't get put down on their personnel cards, but given that they were born in Germany and had gotten out of Germany, the exodus was mostly of Jews, not non-Jewish Germans. So it was a very, very high proportion of them were German Jews.
You call the book Sons and Soldiers. Talk to me about sons. It's an interesting part of the story.
Yeah, the dramatic arc of this story, if you will, starts with them as boys, where either their families sent them out when the families couldn't get out, and again through these relief organizations that were set up and would, to be fair, most of them would only take one child per family, one child under the age of 16, to help as many families, in other words, as they could. And the parents had to make a decision as to which of their children they would send out. And most families sent their eldest sons out, thinking that if they didn't make it, the families themselves didn't make it, that this boy would carry their name on wherever he went. And that was often what happened. Some of these sons, if you will, did get out with a relative or two, or in some cases maybe they did get out with their whole families, but they were sons coming to America, coming as boys. And then in really a very short span of time, from, say, the mid-30s, late 30s to early 40s, in that short period of time, they went from sons to soldiers being in the war. And then they found themselves back in Europe. I mean, this is Nazi-occupied Europe that they had been lucky to escape the first time, and now they're going back.
The story is so bizarre. I mean, you couldn't make this thing up. Now you focus on, 8 people, 8 boys to men? I think.
Yeah, 6.
6, okay. And people like Martin Selleck, who endured years in Dachau. I mean, oh my gosh, right? Got out. Stephen Louis is another one, I think. Manny Steinfeld, I love the fact that he went from a nice Jewish name to Manny, Americanized. But here's the story that interests me, and that is, why the ones that you chose? Were they the ones who were alive? How did you get to those stories?
Well, that's a very good kind of inside baseball question, and nobody's asked me that, and I'm glad you have. And that was one of the more difficult decisions for me to make. I ended up finding, we figured out, going through records in the archives and then going through databases, that there were about 100 of these Ritchie boys still alive today, or at least 2 years ago, say, when I started. I'm sure there's less now. And I found about 24 who, were able to talk, remembered. Not everybody has 70-year memory, and ready to. And so when I found somebody like that, I would pack my bag and go to them and spend a couple of days doing taped interviews. So I interviewed, as well over, as I say, a dozen or so. And but what I decided to do, I didn't want to have so many names in the book that it read like the Manhattan White Pages. I in narrative nonfiction, you'd like to come back to a character that the reader remembers, that they bond with. And so in choosing my cast, if you will, I also wanted them to be at different places at different times in the war. And that was actually pretty easy because they were in these small teams. In other words, they weren't just serving with another 4,000 Ritchie Boys. They were 4 to 6 men assigned to the 82nd Airborne, one regiment of the 82nd Airborne, 4 men assigned to another regiment. So what was good was I got complete coverage from D-Day through the war, through the Battle of the Bulge, everything, and then going into the camps the last month of the war, the concentration camps, as Allied forces began to find these camps and liberate them. And who was there but these Ritchie Boys, who in some cases, some of the fellows that I have in the book, they were afraid the moment they walked in the front gate that they would find their mom or their father or their brother or sister, and there was kind of emotional charge to it.
Oh, can you imagine? First of all, can you imagine going back into Germany? But we're going to discuss that in a second. I want to go to this. First of all, how did you find these guys at their later stage of life? Was there something consistent in all of them as to the telling of their tale, their feelings, how they dealt with all of this? Did you find that there was something cohesive? They've got to have a heroic countenance to them.
Well, I'll tell you, for starters, I was just absolutely amazed. They had what they'd all done with their lives. They had these complete, fulfilling, successful lives, and they must have been bright, absolutely smart young men back then in the 40s, because after the war they went on to careers in academia and business and the law, and it was just amazing to see them then 70 years later. Now, it is true that some of them had not spoken in detail about their story, not only what they had done in the war, but, the painful stuff about the 30s and what was going on in Germany as the Nazis took over. I've had a number of families contact me, reach out to me and say, we're so glad that Dad or Grandpa told you what he told you, because he's never told us that. And so I think in some cases I sort of gave them a reason to go back. It wasn't always easy for them. I mean, as you can imagine, there were many times when, I almost felt a little guilty, kind of like a therapist asking them how they felt about this and how they felt about that. Of course, I needed to have that for the book. But they were just they're still an amazing group of men, and it was just my honor to know them and to be able to tell their stories.
Did they get together?
They did not get together until about 8 or 10 years ago. They had a reunion, and one of the reasons I think they didn't get together again was because in the war they served in these really small units, and so when, say, the 82nd Airborne had a big reunion, they didn't join that because they were kind of outsiders. Plus, let's remember, they still had German accents. They weren't guys that would go down and to the VA or to the Veterans Hall and play bingo and drink beer on Thursday night. They weren't really accepted by still a lot of GIs because of their accents. We had just defeated Germany, and there was still prejudice there. So they went about their own lives, and then didn't really have a lot of contact with other Ritchie Boys. But then a documentary was done by a German filmmaker 10 years ago, and on that occasion, I would say maybe about 20 of them got together here in the United States for a premiere of the documentary, and that, I'm told, was the very first reunion of Ritchie Boys.
The thing that startled me in the beginning is how you tell the story, each of their stories about life prior to Hitler, when Hitler came in, how they got out, what happens to the family. I don't want people to think that this is anything less than the most heart-wrenching drama that you create in this book. Wonderfully done. You care about each of these boys and what happens to their families. They're dimensional. And you say the Ritchie Boys, and I'm worried about that only because they are the Manny Steinfelds. They are a Stephen Louis. They are a Martin Selig and the others. And I think that's important to make. Here's something else. I want to talk to you about this. And that is, you mentioned they were German. And it was, of course, during the war. So there were a lot of people who aren't too thrilled about Germans. Even after the war, it was worse. But they were also Jews. And I don't want to gloss over the fact that in America at that time, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism, as there would be. And who knows, aren't we finding out today it still is alive and kicking, unfortunately. But there is a scene in the book when they are at Camp Ritchie. I want to keep saying Fort Ritchie, Camp Ritchie. And they're like looked upon as, what are you guys doing here? You're Germans and you're Jews, right? And somebody has to take control and say, no, we're gonna utilize these guys. You tell that story.
Right. Well, I do know that even for these guys who were, before they were assigned to Camp Ritchie, were in other units in the Army and at some bases here in the United States. One in particular, Werner Angris, the group that he was with, there were about 20 of them assigned to an infantry division. And they gathered them all together and took their guns away and took their dress uniforms away and put them in working clothes. And instead of putting them in the barracks with other GIs, they slept in tents in the field. They were the Germans, the Heine's, all kinds of terrible things were said, and they were put to work peeling potatoes and cleaning the latrines. And that's really what he thought he was going to do for the entire war, even though Werner ached to be part of it and get into the fight and help go back and liberate his homeland and free Europe and try and find his family, which was he'd lost contact with, who were still over there. And that's another thing. Let me digress 1 second. I mean, the motivation for these guys when they did go over, when they were part of the campaign in Europe, was a hope and even a dream to reconnect with their families, with relatives they had left behind, and they hoped they could do that either during the war or immediately after the war. And so anyway, getting back, there was this prejudice against these guys in the Army, and then when they got to Camp Ritchie, and they were with so many of their own, they felt like they had come home, and they said the experience of being in dormitories where it was not just German. They had people from they had people from Austria, and they had people from Czechoslovakia and Italy, and they were like, at any one time in this army barracks could be 8 or 9 languages being spoken, which made it kind of odd for, an army barracks. But then when they got deployed overseas, and here they were, these trained interrogators, a unit of 4 guys reporting for the 106th Regiment, and they'd walk into the headquarters and presenting themselves, and the officers, in some cases, many cases, I was told, would look at them and say, my God, what are we going to do with these guys? Should we let them still have their guns? Can we turn our backs on them? Can we trust them? Again, it was all about the German accent, the fact that they had been German citizens. They had quickly been made into naturalized American citizens before they were shipped overseas. But, here they are. Well, one of them very eloquently, and I think it was Martin Selling, said to the officer who was questioning them openly as to what they were going to do with his team, look, sir, there will come a time when you will consider us very valuable, and it will happen when you have prisoners, German prisoners, and you want to get information from them. And that's what we're trained to do. Well, that happened in very short order, and the kind of information they would get from these prisoners would be very tactical stuff like, where's that minefield that you just put in? Is it over there or is it over here? Not only information that would help that regiment, that division win tomorrow morning's battle, but would save American lives. And so they became valued, as did that information. And from then on, they were I think really, really accepted.
I can't underestimate, and you certainly paint a very clean, clear, extraordinary picture of the kind of rigorous training these guys had to go through in order to be able to do what they were going to do. Talk a little bit about that. That was astonishing to me.
Well, and this initially this 8-week course, and some of them stayed over for additional courses and specialties after the 8 weeks. But it was not only in the classroom, but it was in the field, and it was 6 days a week and very vigorous. Some of these fellows who had a year or two of college said it was rougher than any college course they had taken. They first had to, they were taught everything that we knew about the German army, its makeup, its strengths, its weaknesses. They had to know this because in interrogating prisoners, they wanted to know what new information they might be getting from this guy that is important. They also wanted to know enough so that if they got false information, they would understand that this guy is not telling them the truth. Also, this dovetails into a type of interrogation. They were taught 4 basic types of interrogation, and one being superior knowledge, and that's where the interrogator, in an attempt to get more information out of a prisoner, overwhelms him with a few small details about his own unit, such as knowing the name of his commander, or maybe a little bit of history about the unit. And when the interrogator shares that with the prisoner thinks, well, if they know that much about my unit, what's the matter with me telling them a little bit more to get a cigarette or a candy bar? So that tended to open them up. But you can imagine they weren't going to be able to go into the field with a lot of their classroom notes. There was a lot of memorization of these kinds of details, or these kinds of this kind of information that they had to keep in and retain.
What about enhanced interrogation? Was there any of that, or?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one that I asked every one of them. And to a man, they told me, we call it by that rather polite term today, enhanced interrogation, but what it is, of course, torture, where you're hurting somebody physically until you get the information you want from them. They not only were trained not to do it, but to a man, they told me, we weren't going to sink to the depths of the Nazis and be them, because we aren't them. And secondly, they felt that and believed that torturing, hurting somebody was not the best way to get valid or truthful information, that somebody would be inclined to just tell you anything to get you to stop pulling their fingernails out. And they found it much more effective and, of course, humane to talk to them, to offer them a cigarette. But if you work with me here a little bit, there's a hot meal waiting for you. In theory and practice, the best time to interrogate a prisoner is immediately after he's been captured. And that's why these teams of interrogators, the Ritchie Boys, had to be assigned to these frontline combat units, because as soon as a prisoner was taken, they needed to sit down in the field, in the tent, while these prisoners were confused, scared, hungry, and get the information that they could from them. Now, that's not to say they didn't use fear, because that was one of the techniques of interrogation, is you find out what a prisoner's anxieties and fears are, and then think and let him think that those will become a reality if he doesn't cooperate. So some of the Ritchie Boys went to pretty extreme measures to do that. They figured out, for example, that the Germans were a lot more afraid about being captured by the Russians than they were by the Americans. And so one of the Ritchie Boys dressed up as a Russian officer, and when a German prisoner would be uncooperative, another Ritchie Boy would take him over to the tent and say, "I'm turning you over to my comrade here, Comrade Kukroff, and he will be taking you to the east." And every time that happened, the uncooperative German prisoner would blanch and say, "Oh, let me try to answer your questions again. Could you please take me back to your tent?" So.
Right. Fascinating, isn't it? Listen, let's not underestimate the danger they were putting themselves in. First, if they were just Americans, they were in danger. Fact is, they were German citizens. They had family that they could be compromising. They were Jewish. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yes. As you say, anybody in war is in danger, but there was an added aspect of it for them, being not only Germans, but being Jews. And there was grave concern before they were sent overseas as to what would happen to these fellows if they were captured, and if the Germans found out who they were. And so, as I said before, they went overseas. They were made naturalized U.S. citizens, standing before a federal magistrate, raising their right hand. At that time, they were afforded the opportunity, if they wanted, to change their Germanic or Jewish-sounding name. And some of them did. Some of them didn't. Some of the fellows also asked for a new set of dog tags, because the dog tags traditionally will carry a letter for representing the soldier's religion. And rather than have H for Hebrew or J for Jew, they wanted it either blank or, P for Protestant or something other than, why wave that red flag? As it turned out, I found out in my research that it was not an unwarranted fear, and I documented a case of 2 Ritchie Boys being captured along with about 100 other Americans during the Battle of the Bulge, and they had been interrogating some German prisoners the previous day, and then they all were captured by the Germans. And as they were walking down the road, some of the recently released German prisoners found an SS officer on the side of the road and said, "See those 2 guys? Those are Jews from Berlin." They were questioning us, so this SS officer had them separated, taken out from the rest of the Americans who were being marched down the road to a POW camp and, spend the rest of the war there. But these 2 Ritchie Boys were then taken into a field and summarily executed.
Yeah, horrible, just absolutely horrible. It's also this, they were fighting 2 wars. They were fighting their personal war for their family, for themselves, for their homeland, and they were fighting as Americans. Did any of them talk to you about that?
Well, it was for them a personal crusade, and I think that as several of them told me, nobody needed to worry about our motivation. And I would say that, typically young soldiers maybe aren't particularly anxious to go to war, eager to go to war. These guys were cut from a different cloth. They wanted to go. They knew and had seen firsthand the dangers of the evil that was spreading across Europe, and that had taken in in some cases their families, and so it was not only a fight for their new homeland, America. They did feel patriotic about being Americans and about fighting for this country, but it was also about liberating their homeland and finding their families, and just realizing that this evil had to be defeated, and they wanted to be part of it.
Astonishing statistic you point out in Sons and Soldiers. A post-war Army report found that more than 60% of the credible intelligence gathered, 60%, let me say that one more time, 60% of the incredible intelligence gathered in Europe came from the contributions of the Ritchie Boys. That makes me want to cry. I tell you, it's overwhelming to think just how much they put them on the line, and the remarkable job that they did. And Bruce, that until you really started to tell the story, it was a virtually unknown story. That's amazing to me, and I wonder about that too. I had it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and let me say it a third time. That day that I found that report at the National Archives, that nearly 60%, and that is like a big number of the most valuable intelligence in ETO, the entire European theater of operations, came from these teams of interrogators known as the Ritchie Boys. And when you think of all the personnel and all of the equipment and all of everything that was over there fighting that war, isn't that an amazing fact? And it were 2 types of intelligence, not only tactical, as I say, where's the minefield out in front of us, but also strategic intelligence. Some of these Ritchie Boy teams were further back at Corps and Army headquarters and were analyzing the information that came in from the frontline interrogators and putting in reports for the generals and the war planners, so they could decide where is the next battle going to be, where are we going to meet that Panzer division, and where do we want to cut the German army off that is, trying to flee out of France. And so they did not only the close-up, in-your-face kind of intelligence, but the bigger picture intelligence as well, and that is amazing.
And then I want to go back to, you really have to question why this story wasn't more public until now.
What really kind of sends a chill up my is and is how close. Well, for starters, how close I came to not knowing about the story. Just happenstance, reading the right obituary at the right time. But bigger than that is how close we came to not having this story and book written while these guys are still alive, because obviously at the age they're at now, I went around the country interviewing guys who were ranged in age between 90 and 99, and we're losing the World War II generation, in great numbers every day, and there will come a time in the not too distant future where they're all gone, and so I'm just so glad that I was able to bring this story out, but that somebody was able to bring it out while they were still alive. Some of them were still alive to talk to.
I've been speaking with Bruce Henderson, the author of more than 20 nonfiction books. His latest book is Sons and Soldiers. For more information on Mr. Henderson and his books, visit brucehendersonbooks.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Bruce Henderson, the author of Sons and Soldiers, and David King, the author of The Trial of Adolf Hitler. Tune in to Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne. Nearly 300 episodes available at hallicasser-jayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. In his new book, The Trial of Adolf Hitler, The Beer Hall Putsch, and the Rise of Nazi Germany, New York Times bestselling author and historian David King details the never-before-told story of how a trial launched the Nazi Party on its way to national and international importance, solidifying the power and popularity of the trial's unlikely star defendant, Adolf Hitler. A little background. The Beer Hall Putsch was a failed coup attempt by the Nazi Party leader Adolf Hitler, along with World War I hero Erich Ludendorff and other leaders, to seize power in Munich, Bavaria in November 1923. About 2,000 Nazis marched to the center of Munich, where they confronted the police, which resulted in the death of 16 Nazis and 4 police officers. Hitler himself was not wounded during the clash. 2 days later, Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. What followed was a scandalous courtroom drama, the putsch discounted by the New York Times as a farce that would definitely eliminate Hitler and his nationalist socialist followers, but which actually led to the birth of the demagogue, Hitler brilliantly using the proceedings as a bully pulpit for his Nazi ideology. Convicted, it was during his short prison term that he wrote his earth-shattering Mein Kampf. Let's talk. All right, David, give us a little history lesson before we get into the meat of this story that you have so brilliantly written. It's very readable, and you should be proud of that, because I couldn't put it down. Germany, World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was devastated, and maybe you can give us, before we get ahead on this story, a little understanding of Munich versus Berlin and the monarchy. In other words, set the stage for the rise of Hitler. Talk to me.
Okay, well, first, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
But yeah, with the First World War, at this time, Germany was a very young country. I mean, by the time, of the putsch, it was only 50 years old. But during that time, as a unified state, that is, and during that time, the growth had been spectacular. I mean, both as a military power, industrial power, and they went into the war, and in one way, but by the time it was over in 1918, the defeat was a shock. The news was censored, so they knew of the victories, but the defeats they didn't quite know as much. So the loss in 1918 was a shock, and they had expected to, war is expensive, so they expected to make their money back in the territories abroad that they'd conquered, but it didn't happen that way. So, in fact, when the Treaty of Versailles is signed, they lose territory, something like about 13% territory, 10% of the population, and big restrictions on what the military can and cannot do. No more than 100,000 people in your army, that sort of thing. And plus, they had to pay reparations, which would eventually be settled like something like $33 billion. But they didn't know that at the time. They knew it was going to be high, and they also had to admit that they were the only cause of the war, which was not very realistic, and but they had to agree to that. I mean, it was so bad. I mean, it was a humiliation. There were rumors that the people would come and sign the treaty and then maybe blow their brains out there or thereafter.
And there were other things too, though. There was also, I mean, these people were left in sheer poverty, and just to buy something to eat cost fortunes. I mean, it was a mess, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it was. Because if you look at the mark, the German mark, 1914, when the war started, right before the war, let's say, it was 4. It was about 4 marks to $1. By the end of the war, it was 8. Oh, and it's getting worse. But then it gets worse and worse and worse. So that by 1923, when Hitler's in the putsch, just a few years later, about 12,000 at the beginning of the year, and it just keeps falling. 25,000, 100,000, 1 million, 500 million, billions, and it eventually bottoms out to like 6.7 trillion marks to $1.
Well,
so if you
so there you go, economics. Yeah.
I mean, think what you could think what you could do with that money before the war, and then say you've saved and saved and saved, and I mean your savings aren't going to go very far. I mean, it's literally wheelbarrows. I mean, they have 2,000 printing presses around the clock just trying to print the money, and I mean it becomes a farce. I mean it's a nightmare. At the time, I mean, it looked like it might be the end of capitalism in Germany. The death throes at sea.
So let's take it here then. So let's just say, out of the throes of World War I, not only humiliation but economic strife, all the things that lead to people being desperate. And out of that rises Adolf Hitler. We all know him as the Fuhrer. I think most people only know him that way, except for historians like you. So where did he come from? What shaped this guy? What was he so angry about? And by the way, his mustache, I love the, forgive me, but you said it, not I, snot break before.
There was one of his advisors that was trying to get him to get rid of that snot break, and Hitler wouldn't listen. Hitler did not seem to listen that much ever. But
talk to me about who he was.
Well, at the trial in 24, he's identified as, quote, a writer. And when he came to Munich in 1913, so this is like 11 years before, not 1912 as he says in Mein Kampf, it's 1913. But when he comes to Munich, he wants to be a painter. Munich at that time was a very sophisticated city. The culture, I mean, still is, but I mean, especially, this was having a golden age in arts and culture. And so Munich, which is another thing that really struck me, I liked about the story. I mean, how did Munich get from this place where, the Kandinsky and Klee to this, the Hitlers and the Himmlers? I mean, if it could happen to Munich, it could happen anywhere. Yeah. But Hitler arrives there. He said, what's being here? And he goes off to war and comes back, and he really starts. The historians are learning a lot about this time, because if you follow Mein Kampf, Hitler is not telling the truth. He's omitting a lot of things, covering over other things. He's doing this at the trial too. So I mean, historians are really starting to learn this a lot more about this period, like how Hitler's work with the revolution in Munich, and he's with the military, and he's basically going to research these far-right groups, the National Socialist Party, as it will be called. And he's reporting on them for the military, because the military, he said, why do they want to research this? It's because they're trying to win back the people. Because during the war, a lot of people had drifted off to the left, and the communists or the socialists. And so they were trying to figure out a way to win them back.
But let me interject here. So the point that I want to make here before we go further is, first of all, he's Austrian, so he's not in German. And I love when he says the homeland, the fatherland. It's not his fatherland. But I want to understand why he is so angry. Is it because of what he was gassed during the war? That you make that point. But what in his background has him so I want to save the world? Or is it just politics or power? What was this guy after?
Yes,
the above.
Yes, I mean, that's one of the things with the. We were jumping ahead of ourselves because Hitler, being Austrian, had they followed the law, high treason, he should have been deported.
Right.
But I guess we're jumping ahead of ourselves with that. But as far as what moves it, I mean, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate on trying to figure, how do you explain the irrational in rational terms. There's, of course, a lot of failure. I mean, from the Vienna days, trying to get into art school. A lot of, how do you do it quickly? I mean, he was down and out, not quite as down and out as he would portray himself, but he was very much down and out in Vienna and also Munich. And Germany was in such a poor state at this time, and has perfect conditions for somebody to thrive in like Hitler, somebody who could play on this chaos, as he will do. And he needed that chaos. He also needed to have an enemy.
He was good at making it. Yeah, that we're going to talk about that in a minute. Here's something that's interesting to me, and I think you kind of play on this too. The cast of characters around this guy, astonishing. I mean, Hollywood writers couldn't make this stuff up. What are the chances, David, of characters like Hitler, Göring, Hess, all of them coming together, all of them, you know, with a common theme in their lives that led them all to the same political, emotional, and ideological state? Doesn't that just strike you in and of itself? You have to go, what in the world? How did this happen?
Yes, exactly. That was another thing that kind of, when I originally started with the book, I thought it'd be, this story, the Beer Hall Putsch, the story of Germany as a way to understand Germany in the early 20s, and how Munich went under this change, and also these characters. I mean, I thought it would be that because a lot of the people that will be with them later on are already here in Munich at the same time. And a lot of them are like Hitler, not German, or at least had origins or connections abroad. Hess, born in Egypt, and Göring with his Swedish wife, and a lot of time abroad, and Putzi, a lot of them that were a lot of people from the Baltic. So it just seemed like a really interesting place where all these people would come together. And this cultural center, which is that was another thing that always just caught my interest. But yeah, I mean, what a cast. They were like Schwebner Richter was another guy that really caught my interest. He's the guy that when the putsch happens, he's marching arm in arm with Hitler, and Schwebner Richter will get shot and die. So if the bullet been a foot or two away, could have hit Hitler. And his Schwebner Richter's valet wrote an unpublished memoir, which is very fascinating, just for understanding the times and just recreating this atmosphere, or trying to recreate this hot-house atmosphere of Munich as descends into chaos.
Right. The National Socialist Party, we know as the Nazis, went through, I guess, different incarnations till it finally got to where it went. I'm always interested in a historian's perspective on these right-wing, the rise of these right-wing parties. And as you researched, what was your thought there? Was that all that was left for people to go to after the war?
Oh no, it was interesting. Yeah, it was one of many on the far right. You also had the far left. The far left was another big option, was winning a lot of people.
Not enough.
Yeah. But for a lot of the monarchists and the militarists, they were really worried about that because they were winning far more than they wanted. But even on the far right, what really separated the National Socialists from any of these other, anti-republic, anti-Semitic, anti-Marxist, anti-parliament groups? I mean, there's not a lot, historians would say. I mean, it wasn't very original, if you can use that word, in its ideas. But one thing they did have was someone like Hitler, who was a speaker who could target his audience, target their fears and their emotions. He also had a private army. A lot of these groups had, thugs, but the Nazis had stormtroopers. And Göring was leading them at this time and trying to make them, a little less disorganized. And they were, it was intimidation. Go in and you beat up your enemies. Hitler wanted to win the streets. And he would say every time there's a big fight, the people would beat up, would come and want to join them. And even if we get bad press, it's still press. And that's a good thing, even if they're at least talking about us, Hitler would say. And so that was another thing that they had. They didn't really have a lot of historians wouldn't see a lot of advantages, if you can use that word, over other far right.
Right.
Groups. But they had that. And those had youth. I mean, they were very young, a very young group. So they had this sort of dynamism that will come with this sort of, that the youth can bring that maybe older people don't do as much.
So let me throw this one in. You also quote that something that Hitler said was that, quote unquote, cruelty impresses. This guy had a streak in him that was very evident from very early on that certain people used to their advantage and others seem to have ignored, right?
Yes, they do, and he among the stormtroopers, it certainly helped him, I would say, because again, a lot of these guys were thugs and hooligans. They wanted to fight. A lot of them, not necessarily all of them. And one of the fascinating things with this was in 1945, at the end of World War II, the U.S. Army captured the Hauptarchiv, which is like this massive collection of documents that the Nazi Party had collected themselves. For historians, ironically, to write about the Nazi Party. And they had in this a massive file, thousands of pages, were a lot of interviews with stormtroopers. These were, maybe 20 years later. So I was able to go through and read some of these. They were talking about these days. These were like the glory days for the Nazi Party. The Beer Hall Putsch time, that is. But there's another thing that Hitler would see this at the trial. He would try to bring in the thugs and the hooligans that like to brawl, and also but that's not enough to win a country. So he also has to try to bring in more middle class, more of the core people. And Hitler will do that better than a lot of other people on the far right who can't, walk that balance.
Of course, I want to talk about the putsch itself, but I want to talk about the Jewish question. And I know the kind of research, David, that you did on this book. It's enormous and it's exhaustive, and I think you have a really good perspective on all of this. And I want to say to you, with this guy Hitler, because we've already established a little bit about who he is and what a mastermind he is and how manipulative he is, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the Jewish question, because he was truly anti-Semitic, because he saw it as an avenue to power, because it was a convenient tool, the old, use the Jews as scapegoat, all of the above. It's just interesting to me that his key people all seem to have a Jewish history, be that with a person or experience in their path. They all seem to have something going on there, right?
Yes, I think that this is a big question historians have been wrestling with. Like Alan Bullock, who wrote one of the first classic Hitler biographies, he had the Nuremberg files too, one of the first to use that in the early 50s when it came out. He saw Hitler as this Machiavellian who's just the arch politician. Like he says in Mein Kampf, you have 5 enemies, A, B, C, D, E. Don't make them 5 enemies. Make A, B, C, D, E all one enemy. Because that's a great way to manipulate. And that's one school. Another school is like, another British guy, Bullock was at St. Catherine's, Oxford. Another guy across town in Oxford, Hugh Roper. So, I think Hitler really means it. He really means, and and he got that by reading Mein Kampf in German. And I'm more on the Trevor Roper end. I think Hitler really, really means, I think he knows it's good politics, but, I don't think he is an actor. You see that at the trial. But I think he really means it. I think he's just a rabid anti-Semite. He makes no mistake of that at the trial. And so I don't think it's just a game. I think he's, and a lot of people, when the memoirs describing Hitler, they will talk about this sort of conviction that, he thinks he's, basically thinks he's like a doctor getting rid of disease.
Well, there's a certain irrationality to it all as well, obviously. But let's move to the putsch and set it up for us. What are his goals there? Was he so smart, and I think he obviously was, that he knew what it was that he had to do in order to get himself known, or, because I think the trial is an interesting conversation we're going to have in a second, or, this is just something he was into and he was going to do it, and he didn't think this one through as well as maybe he should have, but it worked out for him nevertheless because of the crazy trial. Talk to me.
The putsch was November 1923 when he will actually storm into the beer hall, but he'd been plotting that for some time. Going back for, you can debate how long, but he'd been trying to figure out how to act. And by putsch, just, again, to try to take over the government. That's what he's going to do. He's going to march into the beer hall in Munich, fire his pistol in the air, and proclaim a national revolution. But, it's not going to work. But he'd been planning on it, and how much would just come out during the trial. But he really rushes things up because he finds out that on November 8th, the leader of Bavaria, almost dictatorial powers, strong executive powers, this guy, Gustav von Kahr, was going to give a speech. So Hitler said, now's our time. So they rushed things up. And instead of moving, a couple dates were being tossed up. One of them was like November 11th, for anniversary of World War I armistice. But on November 8th, they decided they move it up. We're going to act because Kahr is going to be there. Anybody in Munich is going to be there. So we can go in and we can get everybody. Is what they're going to go in and take them hostage, basically, and get them to join this revolution. And so that's he thought it would work. He thought he would have the cooperation with the leaders, and at times, I mean, it looked like it might work. I mean, they agree. The leaders do agree to join Hitler. They come on the stage, and it's a big celebration. I mean, it's a very risky move because Hitler he marches in with the stormtroopers, and his cars rally. So a lot of car people. And I found the invitation to the beer hall that night. A rare one, so we had to publish that. Very rare. And so you can, it's full of his supporters. And so Hitler will turn the audience around because he's going in and basically forcing the guy to leave and go into a room that Hess has already booked. So he thinks it's going to work, but it's not very well planned. I mean, it's a joke when it fails because, Hitler, if you're going to take over a government, shouldn't you be maybe in a government office? Shouldn't it be in a military barracks, a beer hall in Munich?
So it doesn't work, and people die, and I have to run ahead on this because I want to get to all the story before we finish, and forgive me for that. We only got a half an hour, unfortunately, but it doesn't work, and people are killed, and he winds up, and one of the other people, Ludendorff, convicted or going to be tried for treason. Oh, Lord. And I love the point that you make is he's not a German citizen, so he could have been deported, and instead they hold a trial. I love this. I love how you handled this because really and truly, you have to ask about how this was handled. What's the story with the Germans?
Yeah, I mean, it looked like the end of Hitler. I mean, the very smart observers like the Frankfurter Zeitung, the New York Times said this is the end of Hitler after the putsch failed. I mean, Hitler thought it was too. I mean, he was really depressed after this was over, and he's in prison. I mean, he's very depressed. He's like, who's going to listen to me now? 20 people had died. 16 of his supporters, or 15 for sure. And one of them seemed to be innocent. He was claimed as the 16th. He was claimed as a supporter later, but he turned out to be someone in the wrong place at the wrong time, it seems. And, but anyways, 20 people had died, and he thought his career was over, and it probably should have been. But the trial gives him another chance, and he could go on and speak and speak and speak, and the judge will let him keep on speaking, and it's reported in great detail. And so Hitler will basically transform this failure into something that looks like a victory, so to speak. I mean, he will come across almost as a martyr or a hero to the far right, and instead of just leading these people on this failed idea. I mean, because one thing that came out about the putsch too is that the people that he kidnaps and takes into the side room, they were also plotting against the Republic. It really seems, and so Hitler messed up their plans. So he's
a hero in a way, right?
So a lot of people on the far right will see him as a hero because he's standing up against Berlin, who sold us out. They will say, we didn't lose the war. We were sold out. We were stabbed in the back. And, I mean, they lost the war. I mean, Germany lost the war. But people won't believe that. They will think that because, again, the news was so censored, they didn't know about a lot of the defeats. They knew about the victories. So he said we have to go in and get back at Berlin, get back at the government, get back at Bavaria, because, again, the guy he kidnapped is going to be now portrayed as betraying Hitler. So he's going to win a lot of people.
So you learn a lot from this, and this is what I think your book is so powerful. It's odd to me this really hasn't been written about in English before. I don't get that because the correlations and the story really explains so much that's been missing in the history of Hitler. But his great gift, that bully pulpit. I always think also, and I don't know, David, if you ever thought about this, the great orator of the day. Roosevelt was great. Churchill was great, and Hitler was great. I mean, right? And who was going to give the best speech? Who could capture the hearts and the minds the best? I have to skip on because of time, but I want to say to you, by the way, we should make the point that it's while he's imprisoned for this very short period of time, by the way, for treason. What was it, 8 months they kept him in prison until they let him go? For treason. He wrote Mein Kampf in jail, and that's something people should understand. I don't know if people know that. I'm wondering what you think has been missed in the analysis of Hitler with all the research that you did. Do you think that people have missed things that you found?
Well, there were a lot of surprises to me as I got into it. A lot of it about the trial itself, about the role of the trial in Hitler's life, about the dynamics of the trial, like the judge. I do think this was a big part of Hitler's life. I mean, I think it was a very important part because, authorities had him. They had him. He was guilty. 3,000 witnesses at the beer hall. Hitler doesn't deny it. In fact, he brags about it. And the law was on their side. they could have gotten rid of him. This was, the law said, he was high treason, and he should have been locked up for a lengthy prison stay. And then after that, another law for the protection of the Republic, said that if you are a foreigner, you should be deported. Hitler, Austrian, of course. So had they just followed the law, he should have been locked up or deported to Austria. And Austria was prepared to take him during the trial. Found the documents. They were prepared for a time. They were prepared to take him. And so had they just followed the law, when the Great Depression hit, Hitler would not be on the scene again to thrive in that chaos.
Yeah, you gotta roll your eyes at that. He could have been stopped is your point at that time, and he wasn't. And oh my gosh, look what happened thereafter. In your opinion, understanding the complex dynamics of the rise and fall of Hitler. And by the way, a point that I want to make before we get there, let me just go back 2 steps. I told you I'm in Germany as we speak, and I've spoken to a lot of my German friends about all of this, and nobody has any answers about why, what, where. It's the shame is there. But I've been looking at the old footage of Hitler, and I have to ask you this because to me, from the beginning to the end, he looks mad as a hatter, David. And here's the point: one can be smart and crazy at the same time, which seems to be a concept in history that people don't seem able to grasp. I'm even thinking about the current times, by the way. Smart and crazy. Most dangerous. What are your thoughts on that?
I've thought about this too, and one problem I have with the mad idea, if he's mad, there's an issue of responsibility that comes up. Unfortunately, if you say someone's mad, are they truly responsible? So I prefer not to go too far along those lines because you don't want somebody to avoid responsibility for all the crimes. I think that would be an issue because it's a big question. You could write, is he, another question, Alan Bullock was asked one time, the historian, is Hitler evil? And he's like, well, if he's not evil, who is? And if you follow, in a court, if you say somebody's mad, you can use that as an argument to get off, and not be guilty for your crimes. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I think he, I almost prefer this sort of like laughing, just monster, he knew exactly what he was doing and clever enough to cover up the traces the best that he could. And I prefer that sort of, but again, you could debate all this.
Right, forever and a day. But I think the interesting thing is that there are degrees of madness and there are degrees of smart and there are degrees of evil as well. And in there lies probably the answer to all of this. I was starting to say before I bounced back, do you think, given the complex dynamics of the rise and fall of Hitler, could another Hitler rise again?
Oh, yes. It's very frightening. Because you could see. This one of the things. Like again, one new thing I thought of with Hitler as I was getting into this is that we're used to Hitler, the pinnacle of the Third Reich, leading the armies out to the war, the Holocaust. At this time, 10 years earlier, he's across the room, defendant, and he's not like shrieking like a madman. He does do that some, but he's arguing things. He's got his he's attacking. He's arguing. He's more frightening in some ways. It's just this across the room. All this we know looking back as ahead, but this is the chance where history could have turned, and it doesn't, and it's very very frustrating. One historian said too. He said if you were to go back in time, go back to say 1914, before World War I, and ask an informed, intelligent European, okay, which country? Okay, there's going to be a horrific Holocaust. Which country do you think would do it? And he thought, I think he makes a good point. A lot of people probably would have said France or Russia or somewhere else, but few would have said Germany. I think that's a good point. These things are just so hard to imagine, mind-boggling, and I think it could definitely happen again. Like in the trial, in the back room when they have one of the secret sessions, one of the guys explains exactly why he followed Hitler, and he was not anti-Semitic. This is one thing that's also frightening. He would say, we touched on this a little earlier, it's like there's going to be another war. It's inevitable, he says. And we need the people on our side, and Hitler is the only one that can reach him. That's why I like Hitler. And I think there were a lot of people that were willing to indulge this anti-Semitism for what they saw as, for something else that they wanted to achieve. And that's scary. Things like that, add a whole nother dynamic to it. And I find that incredibly frightening.
I've been speaking with David King. His book is The Trial of Adolf Hitler, the Beer Hall Putsch, and the Rise of Nazi Germany. For more information on the book and Mr. King, visit davidkingauthor.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of RESEC LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit hallicasser-jayne.com.